My wife divorced me. 2 months later, I inherited $107 million, and she tried to steal it from me. But then I did something shocking. I forgave her. Not to spare her from justice, but to free myself from the pain. She had left me for another man, saying our time was up. When the money arrived, she returned with forced smiles and a disguised plan of reunion. I didn't fall. I handed over what was due to the authorities, but in my heart, I surrendered forgiveness. Today I live with a new love, someone who chooses truth over any fortune. She, who thought she could add gains to regret, ended up alone, with a void that not even millions could fill. I forgave, yes, but I would never go back. Each one moved on, and I moved on in peace. But it wasn't simple. Nothing in this story was. Because before forgiving, I bled inside. And no one saw. No one cared about the part of the person left. What it's like to be left without explanation, watching the person you love most leave without a backward glance, without regret, without hesitation. Just leaving. Coldly, as if all the years sharing dreams, bills, and breakfast were rubbish. The worst part wasn't her leaving, the worst part was the reason. And it was the way she made it seem like it was my fault. As if I'd become a weight, a burden, as if my love had an expiration date. She didn't have the courage to say she was already with someone else. She said she needed to live another phase, that she'd lost herself, but in truth, she was already in the arms of another man. And I only learned this later, when half of me was already drowning in the grief of a marriage that, for me, still existed. I found out the cruelest way. Messages accidentally left on a computer that was still logged in. Old conversations, photos, plans. They already had hotel reservations before the divorce was even finalized. She told him she'd soon be free. That with me she was boring, an obligation. That I was a good man, but dull. And that's when I felt my heart break. Because until then, even with the pain, there was still a glimmer of hope inside me. A fantasy that she could come back, that it was just a phase, that she was confused. But no. She wasn't confused. She was in love. Just not with me. And all of this silently destroyed me. I was swallowed by shame. By humiliation. By the feeling of being replaced by something newer, more fun, more intense. I constantly wondered where I'd gone wrong. If I'd failed to tell her I loved her. If I'd been too predictable. If routine had killed desire. If my mistake was trusting too much, loving too much, or simply not realizing the abyss forming beneath our feet. Because, for me, we were a team. I still saw beauty in the small gestures. But she had already said goodbye to me months before she'd uttered the first word about separating. After the divorce, I just existed, I didn't live. My days dragged on amidst memories and regrets that weren't even mine. Friends told me it was better this way, that now I could start over, that I deserved someone who would choose me completely. But those words sounded like empty clichés. Nothing soothed the pain of imagining her sharing the same laughter, the same sheets, the same life with someone else. The pain of knowing someone had entered the place that was once mine. And then came the inheritance. It was as if the universe had, for a second, turned its eyes on me. $100 million. $100 million that wouldn't bring me back what I wanted, but would change everything around me. Money doesn't buy love, I already knew that. But I also quickly learned that it buys masks, intentions, and false regrets. Because as soon as the money arrived, she appeared. Smiling. Nervous, but smiling. As if nothing had happened. As if she'd just left behind a bad phase. As if she'd suddenly discovered that she still loved me. She came with sweet words, forced memories, or rehearsed nostalgia. Her body bore the scent of before, but her soul bore the coldness of someone who chose to leave. I thought about you every day, she said. I missed you. I just needed time to understand myself. And I, looking into her eyes, understood. It wasn't longing. It was calculation. It was hunger disguised as affection. She didn't return for love. She returned because, upon learning of the inheritance, she realized she might have left too soon. Because the new no longer seemed so promising without money. And the old was now a millionaire. But what she didn't expect was that I had changed. Because the man she left behind died the day he saw his love used as a bargaining chip. In his place, another was born. A man tired of begging for affection. A man who understood that forgiveness isn't synonymous with weakness, it's freedom. And that's why, instead of yelling, humiliating, or taking revenge, I forgave. Not for her. But for myself. Because I no longer wanted to carry that burden. Because I knew that, from then on, life would show me the difference between choice and regret. She tried to deceive me. She tried to manipulate me. She even devised a legal plan to claim part of the inheritance, claiming she was entitled to it because of the years of marriage. But she forgot that betrayal also leaves legal trails. And that I, however hurt I was not stupid. I handed over everything I needed to the authorities, with enough evidence for her to be seriously questioned. But I remained calm. No spectacle. No public revenge. Just the truth. And that's when she began to fall. Not because of me, but as a consequence of her own choice. The cruelest thing. It wasn't seeing her exposed. It was seeing her look me in the eye, weeks later, and say with a broken voice, I was wrong. I thought what we had no longer existed. But you were my home. And I left my home. She cried, but it no longer affected me. She called me love, but that no longer made sense. Because the love I had died. She killed. And I wasn't willing to dig up the past just because she now realized the value of what she lost. Yes, I forgave her. I looked her in the eyes and said, it's okay. You did what you thought was right at the time. But now it's too late. And that was the greatest punishment. Because there's nothing more devastating than realizing you lost a true love through a thoughtless choice, and that there's no way back. That the one you abandoned now loves someone else. That you weren't betrayed by anyone. You were betrayed by yourself. I moved on. And it was when I stopped looking for love in familiar faces that it appeared. Quietly, honestly, cleanly. Without promises of eternity, but with true surrender. And, with this new person, I understood that love isn't about fleeting intensity. It's about constancy. It's about truth. And, above all, it's about reciprocity. And that I've never had, until now. She, on the other hand, watches everything from afar. Too late. Too spiteful to admit it, too proud to try again. And still, broken. Because it wasn't the money she lost. It was the only person who truly loved her, even when she no longer deserved it. But what she never knew, is what I discovered on my new wife's wedding day. The truth about what happened between her and her lover. What he revealed to me. And what she never imagined I would know. And that's what changes everything. That's what still hurts. Because that day, when she cried on her knees, begging to come back, she still thought I didn't know anything. But I did. I always knew. And that's why, even though I forgave her, I never looked at her the same way again. Never again. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but built to show, with depth and realism, how betrayal destroys lives, hearts and futures. Get ready to dive into a narrative intense, full of emotion, twists and painful truths. This is not just another story, it's a warning. We wish you a good story, and may she make you feel every word until the end. Now, take a deep breath. What comes next is shocking. They met on an ordinary autumn afternoon, the kind where the leaves dance in the air with a melancholy laziness, as if the world were in slow motion just to allow two strangers to notice each other. She wore a burgundy coat, leather boots, and a book clutched to her chest, as if the outside world were unnecessary noise. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, too distracted to notice the step on the sidewalk, and tripped just as she passed. It was ridiculous, embarrassing, and so sincere that it drew a spontaneous laugh from her and an awkward apology from him. It was in this accidental stumble that the story of Michael and Emily began, 2 simple names carrying hearts full of complex desires. Michael was an architect. Dedicated, methodical, one of those men who bring order even to the chaos of emotions. He grew up with loving but absent parents and learned early on that stability was a choice, not a gift. He approached life like a project, everything needed to have a foundation, every decision had to be logical, but even with all this structure, there was a silent need within him, something that not even the most symmetrical buildings could fill. Emily, on the other hand, was a freelance journalist, passionate about literature and the subtext of people. She had a restless soul, a hunger for untold stories, and an almost poetic mania for romanticizing everything around her. Where he saw structure, she saw poetry. Where he saw risk, she saw opportunity. They were opposites in many ways, but complementary in the things that mattered. The first months of their relationship were marked by a gentle intensity. Michael was captivated by the way Emily spoke about the world, how she found beauty in the ordinary. She, in turn, admired his steadfastness, the way his arms were a silent shelter on days when the world seemed too much. They discussed books, movies, and life plans. Emily had a habit of jotting down random sentences in old notebooks, and Michael, even without understanding the need for it, found it charming. He was punctual, methodical, almost predictable. She would lose track of her schedules, forget where she'd left her keys, but she never forgot to look at him as if witnessing a miracle. They were 2 adults trying to reconcile their baggage with the hope that perhaps, together, they could create something that would last longer than their initial passion. The wedding took place in a small ceremony, with close friends, a bouquet of sunflowers, and whispered promises through tears. There was no luxury, but there was commitment. Emily held his hand like an anchor, and Michael looked at her as if he were seeing the most beautiful project he had ever designed. After the honeymoon, life settled in. Bills to pay, apartment renovations, grocery lists, and lazy weekends watching old movies. Emily wrote articles for independent magazines, while Michael dedicated himself to a practice that was slowly but steadily growing. They laughed over silly things, argued about where to vacation, and were irritated by each other's mess, but they always ended the days lying side by side, sharing comfortable silences and plans for the future. Over the years, love took on a new form. It ceased to be euphoria and became presence. There were no longer butterflies in the stomach, but there was complicity in their eyes, and this, for both of them, seemed more valuable. Romantic dinners gave way to quick meals between meetings, unexpected gifts were exchanged for mutual help with life's small tasks. Still, Emily looked at Michael tenderly, especially when he forgot his own birthdays because he was too preoccupied with deadlines and clients. And Michael, even tired, always left a note on the table with some inspirational quote he found in her notebooks. For years, their marriage was a silent agreement of care. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid. But like every story that seems too calm, there were invisible cracks appearing within. Emily, her soul in turmoil, began to feel a discomfort she couldn't name. The texts seemed to stop coming as they used to, the days became repetitive, and the routine, once cozy, began to feel like a tight shoe. Michael, immersed in his own professional challenges, didn't notice. He tried to solve everything logically, as if feelings could be organized into columns. He saw her fatigue as a phase, something that could be resolved with a trip or a few weeks of rest. But Emily didn't need rest. She needed to feel alive again. There was a period when she started going out more alone. She said she needed inspiration, a breath of fresh air, to reconnect with old friends. Michael supported her, albeit with a certain distrust. He was never controlling, but something in her intuition was starting to ignite like a low, almost imperceptible alarm. Their conversations diminished, their hugs became shorter, and the bed, once filled with nighttime conversations, became too silent. Michael tried to remain calm, but he carried an unease he couldn't name. He still believed in her. He still saw in her eyes the woman who had once bumped into him on the sidewalk. But her eyes now seemed to stare off into the distance, as if trapped in another place, another time, or worse, another person. Even so, he persisted. He suggested dinners, trips, rereading old letters they'd once exchanged. Emily accepted everything with a polite smile, but her enthusiasm was rehearsed, as if she were making an effort to stay where she no longer wanted to be. Michael, confused, began to wonder if he was forcing something that no longer existed. But at the same time, he refused to accept that their love had an expiration date. For him, marriage was about commitment. It was about persisting when the other faltered. It was about knowing there would be dark times, but that the important thing was to keep walking together. It was then that he began to isolate himself emotionally. Not out of anger, but out of self-protection. Emily was no longer his home, but he still lived within her. He worked late, arrived home tired, fell silent in trivial conversations, and filled the silences with instrumental music in the car, trying to silence the scream that was beginning to rise within him. Emily, in turn, immersed herself deeper and deeper in a universe he couldn't access. She seemed to revive. She shone brighter, smiled more, returned home with eyes alight, but unwilling to share. Michael saw this and pretended not to. Perhaps because it was easier to maintain the illusion than to face the truth. Still, even in the face of the emotional abyss, some gestures remained. Emily made him coffee in the morning. Michael left the blanket over her when he left early. Small details that, despite the distance, still suggested some trace of care. Neither had the courage to break up. Neither wanted to be the villain. But they both knew, deep down, that they were living more from memory than reality. Michael clung to past commitments, Emily to the desire for something she couldn't yet name. And so they continued, side by side, but further and further apart. Friends noticed. Some tried to talk, others simply distanced themselves. It was difficult to watch the decline of a couple that, for so long, had been a model of partnership. But no one knew exactly what was happening. Michael was discreet. Emily was smiling. And together, they still maintained appearances with frightening competence. Family dinners, holiday parties, smiling photos on social media, all carefully calculated to appear normal. But deep down, there was no longer normality. There was struggle. There was suppressed pain. There was a silent wait for something they no longer knew what it was. Until one day, she asked to talk. He said he needed some time. That he needed to reconnect. Michael, his heart aching, listened silently. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He just nodded. Because in that moment, something inside him broke completely. He was no longer the same man who waited for her at the end of the day. She was no longer the woman he dreamed of by his side. It was as if they had aged 10 years in just a few months. And yet, there was love. Maybe not the love of the beginning. But a sad, resigned love, one that recognizes it did what it could, but sometimes, that isn't enough. Michael stayed in the house. Emily took a few things. She said she'd be back soon to get the rest. But she never did. Silence settled in. And with it, the loneliness of a man who still couldn't understand where everything had gone wrong. He walked through the rooms and saw her traces. The perfume on the pillow. The book open on the armchair. The favorite mug in the kitchen. Everything still held the presence of someone who was no longer there. And he, amidst the emptiness, tried to piece together the pieces of what had once been his home. But what he didn't yet know was that her absence hid more than doubts. It hid a truth that would change everything. A choice made long before, I need some time. A decision that involved not only the end of a marriage, but the beginning of a deep wound. The betrayal didn't yet have a name, but it already existed. And when it came to light, it would bring with it not only pain, but also a redemption he never imagined experiencing. He didn't know it yet, but what came next would change him forever. Michael spent weeks in a silence that weighed more heavily than any scream. The days blurred between the noise of his own thoughts and the screaming emptiness that had settled in every corner of the house. Emily had left behind more than just clothes and personal belongings, she left holes. One in the closet, another in the sofa, one in the kitchen where he used to sing softly while making coffee, but the biggest was inside him, throbbing like an open wound he couldn't quite pinpoint, only that it hurt. He followed his routine with the rigidity of a poorly timed clock, trying to convince himself it was just a phase, a necessary interval, a pause for reunion. But deep down, something inside him was already whispering that she wouldn't return. And if she did, she wouldn't be the same woman who had left. Emily, on the other hand, was living completely different days. While Michael immersed himself in absence, she seemed to finally breathe. She spent more time outdoors, meeting old friends, rediscovering places, revisiting versions of herself that had lain dormant over the years of marriage. And amid this rediscovery of her freedom, a new presence became part of her days. Someone who began as a coincidence, then as a light conversation, and soon became something she no longer wanted to avoid. It wasn't immediate, but it was intense. And dangerous. Emily allowed herself to sink into long-forgotten sensations, emotions she mistook for love, for desire, for life. And it was in this conscious deception that betrayal was born, subtly disguised as a rediscovery of herself, until it became impossible to hide. She didn't tell anyone. Not because it was just guilt, but because she was ashamed. There was a discomfort she couldn't name. She spent her days torn between the regret she didn't want to feel and the impulse she couldn't control. Sometimes she thought about calling Michael, telling him she missed him, that maybe she'd been hasty. But then I'd look at him and see a new, shining light in him. What I didn't realize was that this glow was a reflection of a stroked ego, not true love. Even so, he chose to continue. He chose to nurture a parallel story while the old one still bled, even if she pretended not to see it. Michael, for his part, began to feel the signs. The dry messages, the increasingly short calls, her lack of any attempt to retrieve what she'd left at the house. Her "I need some time" seemed increasingly definitive, and the lack of explanations slowly gnawed at him. He tried to distract himself with work, with solitary walks, with the futile effort of reorganizing the house as if that would also reorganize his feelings. Sometimes he'd stop in front of the mirror and wonder where he'd gone wrong. Had he become too predictable? Had he failed to see the warning signs? Had loving so calmly made it seem disinterested? He didn't know. And doubt consumed him more than any truth. Until, one Friday afternoon, he decided to visit a mutual friend of theirs. It wasn't with the intention of finding out about Emily, but it turned out to be inevitable. The conversation, at first, was superficial, full of caution and awkward silences. But all it took was a simple question, "Do you know how she is?" for the truth to begin to seep out. The friend hesitated, looked away, tried to change the subject. But Michael persisted. And it was there, in that hesitant gesture, that he felt the ground shake. The friend didn't say it directly. But she didn't need to. The lack of response, the evident discomfort, was enough for him to understand there was more to the story than what was being told. That night was torture. Michael didn't sleep. He spent hours sifting through memories, searching for words, expressions, clues that might have gone unnoticed. And the more I thought, the more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. He began to suspect. Of small but persistent details. Of strategic silences. Of absences disguised as commitments. And that was when, overcome by a suffocating anguish, he decided to do what he'd been avoiding for weeks, check his old computer, the one she used when they still lived together. It was stored in the office, covered in a thin layer of dust. When I plugged it in, I barely knew what I was looking for. He had no plan, just an impulse that screamed louder than reason. And there, among forgotten folders and still logged-in email accounts, he found what he didn't want to see. Messages. Countless. Long, intense, too intimate to be innocent. Conversations filled with complicity, laughter, promises, plans for the future. Plans that didn't include him. Michael read each line with bated breath, as if each word were a direct punch to the gut. Emily spoke of the relief of being away, of how she finally felt alive, of how she'd found someone who made her truly laugh. And worst of all, she spoke of him as if he were just a closed chapter. As if the man who dedicated years to building a life with her was nothing more than an uncomfortable memory. There were dates. There were photos. There was too much evidence for any excuse. Michael no longer needed explanations. It was all there. Raw, painful, real. He sat in the chair, his body trembling, his eyes fixed on the screen as if he could still erase what he'd seen. But he couldn't. And it was at that moment that something inside him broke, definitively. It wasn't just sadness. It was betrayal. Not just of the body, but of the history. Of the plans, the promises, of everything they'd built. Emily hadn't just left. She'd left with someone else. And she'd left behind not just a marriage, but a man who still believed in the possibility of a new beginning. In the days that followed, Michael remained silent. He didn't tell anyone what he knew. He didn't confront Emily immediately. He needed to process it. I needed to understand what to do with that truth. I felt anger, shame, pain, and a loneliness I couldn't quite put my finger on. But alongside all of that, I felt something else, a piercing clarity. Now everything made sense. The distant glances, the feeble apologies, the rush to leave. She was already with someone else. And he was the last to know. Or maybe the only one still pretending not to know. It was in this silence that change began. Michael, who had previously walked like a ghost, began to reclaim his own presence. Not out of revenge, but out of necessity. He began to take care of himself again. He moved the furniture around. He threw out objects that held the scent of a history that no longer existed. He began to go out more, to talk to people he hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't easy. Each step hurt. But it was necessary. And with each passing night, the morning of his marriage gave way to a slow but steady rebuilding. Meanwhile, Emily seemed oblivious to the impact of her choices. Or perhaps she was faking it too well. There were no calls, no messages. Just silence. As if she had erased that part of her life as easily as closing a book. But Michael knew. And that was enough. He knew she had chosen another path. And that, in doing so, she had also freed him. The pain, though sharp, was also an end. An end that, paradoxically, ushered in something new. Something he didn't yet know what it was, but that would come. And it would come with force. Because what Emily didn't know, and what Michael hadn't yet discovered, was that behind that betrayal lay something bigger. A hidden, buried secret that would explain much more than just her desire for someone else. A secret that would reveal not only the fragility of her choices, but the depth of the pain she herself had yet to experience. A secret that would turn the betrayal into something even deeper. Something irreversible. The phone call came on a normal morning, the kind where the gray sky doesn't portend a storm, but hints that something is about to change. Michael answered without recognizing the number, expecting a work call or some ordinary notification, but the voice on the other end sounded like a note off key. It was him. The other one. The man Emily had gotten involved with. For a second, Michael considered hanging up, but there was something in the way the other man spoke, a hidden nervousness, a hesitation between words, that made him listen. On the other end of the line, the man was breathing deeply, as if needing to cross a fragile bridge built with each syllable. He said he needed to see him, that there was something he needed to know, something that, according to his words, Emily would never have the courage to tell. Michael, though reluctant, felt something stir inside him. It wasn't anger anymore. It was a different kind of restlessness. A need to understand what still lay behind everything, to close the last gaps in a story that had already torn him apart. They agreed to meet at a discreet, secluded cafe, where no familiar face could interrupt what was to come. Michael arrived first, sitting by the window, watching the drops run down the glass as if time were melting before his eyes. When the other man entered, there was a strange weariness about him, not physical, but emotional, as if he'd been carrying something for a long time and had only now decided to let it go. He sat in silence. The two stared at each other for several seconds too long. And then, without ceremony, he began to speak. He didn't try to justify anything. He didn't apologize. He simply said it had been a mistake. That it had started unintentionally, but had gotten lost. And that, now, he knew it wasn't all it seemed. Michael listened, impassive, his eyes fixed, his heart racing. Until the other stopped for a second, took a sip of the now lukewarm coffee, and dropped the bombshell with a calmness that sounded absurd. He said Emily never told him the full truth. That their relationship began even before the separation was formalized, and that everything she'd said about needing time, about wanting to reconnect, was just a veil to hide what was already happening behind the scenes. But Michael already knew that. What he didn't know, and which now surfaced like a sharp blow to the chest, was what had happened afterward. The man explained, almost in a whisper, that a few months after the official end of the marriage, Emily had sought him out in desperation. She said she wanted to get back together. She said she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. That all she sought outside of home was an escape from herself, not a search for another love. She asked for a fresh start. She begged for a second chance. And he, surprised, asked if she'd already told Michael that. And that's when the truth came like a blade cutting deep. She said yes. That she had called Michael, told him everything. That she had been ignored. That he had treated her coldly, that he was with another woman, that he didn't want anything to do with her. And that because of that, she was devastated, alone, abandoned for the second time. And then, he, her lover, believed her. He welcomed her. He tried to build something. But soon he began to realize that Emily wasn't whole. That in every gesture, there was a shadow. That the love she claimed to feel was an attempt to forget what she had destroyed. And then he became suspicious. And he called Michael. But Michael never received a call. The silence between them weighed more heavily than any scream. Michael felt his breath catch. He hadn't received any request for reconciliation. No message. No email. Nothing. He stared at the man before him with a mixture of disbelief and pain. It was hard to believe, but it made sense. It made too much sense. Emily had lied. Not just to him. But also to her lover. She had played a new role when her previous one began to crumble. She created a narrative in which she was a victim of rejection. And with that, she continued to feed the fantasy that she was desired, loved, pursued by two men, when in reality, she was running away from her own reflection. Michael said nothing. He stood up, nodded, and left. He walked aimlessly through the streets, like someone not trying to get anywhere, but simply to escape the ground that had just disappeared. The revelation had reopened wounds he'd believed were already healed. Because it wasn't just about betrayal. It was about manipulation. About lies that continued even after the end. About her attempt to rewrite her own story as if no one could notice the erasures. In the following days, Michael decided to confront her. Not for revenge. But because he needed to look into her eyes and understand if there was still some truth within. He called and asked to meet. Emily hesitantly agreed. The meeting took place in a quiet park, where dry leaves covered the ground like a metaphor for what had once been beautiful. When she arrived, there was a tense glint in her eyes. A nervousness hidden by restrained smiles. He was direct. He told her he knew everything. That he had met with the other man. That he knew about the request for reconciliation that never happened. Emily paled. She fell silent. Then she tried to laugh. She said he wouldn't understand. That she was confused. That she didn't know how to deal with everything. But Michael didn't want an apology. He wanted the truth. She tried to explain. She said she was scared. That at some point she actually considered calling. But she didn't have the courage. Because she thought he would hate her. And so she made up the story for him. Because it was easier to be the victim than to admit she'd done everything wrong. She cried. She asked for forgiveness. She said she never meant to hurt him. That she felt lost. That, deep down, she'd always loved him. That everything she'd done was a failed attempt to find herself. That he was the only place where she truly felt at peace. Michael listened to it all with steady eyes and a heart that ached more for clarity than for confusion. He responded with a serenity only someone who has cried every tear can possess. You said you understood. That you understood the fear, the doubt, the mistakes. But that none of that changed the fact that she left him. Not because of someone else. But because she chose to run away. He said forgiveness wasn't a chance to start over, but an ending. And that now, after everything, he finally saw clearly what had previously been blurred by pain. That the love that once existed between them was true, but that she had destroyed it with her own hands. And that now, she would have to live with the weight of having lost someone who still loved her even when he shouldn't have anymore. Emily, before him, broke down. She burst into tears. She tried to hold him. She begged for another chance. She said she could change, that she would do anything. But Michael, with a sad yet determined look in his eyes, said their time was up. That sometimes, forgiveness isn't about rebuilding. It's about letting go. And in that moment, he let her go. The secret had been revealed. It wasn't just physical betrayal. It was emotional, moral, silent betrayal. It was the theater constructed to keep an illusion alive. And now, with all the masks fallen, the truth hurt like never before. And yet, something greater awaited him. Something he hadn't expected. Because even with all the truths revealed, fate still reserved the final word. And it would come as a whisper disguised as chance. Emily remained there, sitting on the park bench, her eyes red, her hands trembling in her lap, and her body hunched over as if something invisible was pulling her inward. Michael had already walked away, his steps firm, but his heart heavy with a new, aching lucidity. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was awareness. He didn't turn around. Not because it was cruel, but because he knew that if he looked back, perhaps the part of her that still recognized the woman he'd once loved might want to reach out. And he didn't want to reach out anymore. Emily, for her part, remained motionless for minutes that felt like hours, feeling the force of her own choices crush all remaining pride. There were no more excuses. Only the image of the man she'd destroyed, and now, lost forever, remained. Michael spent the rest of the day in silence, but not a suffocating silence like before. It was the silence of someone who had finally emptied his soul of questions. For the first time in a long time, there were no more doubts. There was only a harsh but unvarnished reality. When he got home, he went into his room and stared at the mirror for several long seconds. He didn't see himself as someone avenged. Nor did he see himself as a victim. He was simply a man who survived. A man who loved, lost, and understood, too late, that dignity lies not in the chosen, but in those who know how to let go when they are no longer truly seen. It was then, a few days later, that something unexpected happened. He was in a new, recently opened coffee shop, where he used to spend his time reading in the late afternoons. He wasn't looking for anything. Just a break. The girl behind the counter recognized him, not because she'd seen him before, but because a mutual acquaintance had mentioned him. She introduced herself as Claire. She had kind eyes, a light smile, and a non-judgmental way of looking. They talked about coffee, music, books. And for the first time in months, Michael laughed easily. Effortlessly. Without needing to prove anything. Claire didn't ask invasive questions, nor did she try to appear interesting. She simply existed, there, with an honest, calm presence. And that, for Michael, was a relief. As the weeks passed, their encounters became natural. A coffee that turned into 2 hours of conversation. A walk that began without plans and ended with a desire to repeat. Claire spoke little about herself, but when she did, she had substance. She was a visual artist, working as an illustrator for children's books and volunteering on weekends. Michael, accustomed to a pragmatic and predictable life, was captivated by her spontaneity, but even more so by the respect with which she treated silence. Claire never pressured. Never asked about Emily. Never forced an approach. And that was precisely what brought her closer. One night, after a simple dinner shared, they sat on the balcony of her apartment. The air was cool, the city whispered in distant sounds, and the lights of the neighboring buildings flickered like small, nocturnal confessions. Claire picked up a glass of wine, offered it to him, and then, amid the silence, spoke of losses. Not his. Hers. She told of a long-ago relationship that ended when she realized she was alone in a relationship full of appearances. She said she learned, the hard way, that love cannot be sustained without truth. Michael listened in silence, and when their eyes met, there was a mutual recognition. A mirror without pain. Only understanding. And then, as if unhurried, she rested her head on his shoulder. And there, without promises, without definitions, something began. What Michael didn't expect was that the past wasn't over yet. A few weeks later, he received a letter. Handwritten. The envelope bore the handwriting he knew by heart. Emily. He hesitated. For minutes, he just stared at the paper, as if it were a time capsule he wasn't sure whether to open. But he did. The letter wasn't long. Nor was it full of drama. It was sober. Emily said she had started therapy. That for the first time, she was facing her choices with the honesty she'd always avoided. And that she was writing not to apologize again, but to tell him something she hadn't had the courage to say before. You said you knew he deserved to know. That it was his right. And then, in a few lines, you revealed the truth that until then had been buried beneath all the other lies. The day she left, the very moment she left the house saying she needed time to think, she had already made a definitive decision. She wasn't leaving just out of confusion. She was leaving because she was pregnant. The child, however, wasn't Michael's. And she knew it from the start. There was never any room for error. There was never any doubt. In that moment, she chose silence. She considered hiding, considered disappearing, but fear made her cling to her new relationship like a lifeline. She believed the new man would take over everything. But he wouldn't. He said he wasn't ready. That it wasn't part of his plan. Emily, then, lost her footing. And she also lost the pregnancy shortly after, due to complications she herself attributed to extreme stress. She never told anyone. She buried everything with the haste of someone who wants to forget. But the weight consumed her inside. And now, finally, she confessed. Not to clean up her image, but because she couldn't bear to carry it alone any longer. Michael stood there, the letter in his hands, his chest heavy with a kind of pain he couldn't name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pity. It was a kind of mourning for something that never existed. A child that wasn't his. A life she chose to hide. A truth that, perhaps, explained her sad eyes at their last meeting. And suddenly, everything made more sense than he would have liked. The urgency to return. The desperation in her pleas. The vulnerability masked by guilt. She had lost more than her marriage. She had also lost her chance to be a mother. And she chose to keep quiet. She chose to lie. She chose to protect a lie rather than face a reality that, though harsh, perhaps could have been welcomed differently if it had been shared. That night, Michael didn't sleep. He thought about answering. He thought about calling. But he did nothing. Instead, he got in his car and drove aimlessly, until he stopped in front of an old house where he grew up. He sat on the sidewalk as he had done as a child, looked up at the sky, and understood that life is made of cycles that don't always close as we would like. That some truths come too late. That forgiving isn't forgetting. It's accepting that the past cannot be changed. And that, even if there were still traces of pain, he would no longer carry the weight of what wasn't his. In the days that followed, he continued to see Claire. Not as an escape, but as a presence. He told her everything, on one of those late afternoons when trust overflows through the cracks of the soul. Claire listened without interrupting. And when he finished, he didn't say he understood. He simply took her hand, squeezed it tightly, and told her he was there. That he would continue to be there. And in that simple gesture, Michael understood that life still held room for love. A new love. Calm. Real. Emily, for her part, returned to silence. She never wrote again. She didn't respond. And he learned, from the same friend who had hesitated long ago, that she had moved to another city. She started over, alone, with few friends, without the judgmental gaze of someone who knew too much. She never fully recovered. And perhaps you never will. Because the real punishment wasn't losing Michael, nor her son, nor her lover. It was looking at herself and realizing that the only thing truly preventing her from being happy, was herself. And Michael, even after everything, forgave her. Not for her sake. But for his own. Because he learned that holding a grudge is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. And he didn't want to die inside. He wanted to live. And live well. Without hate. Without the past dragging on his shoulders. Because despite everything, he still believed in love. And even more so, in truth. And that was what he chose to carry on with. Time moved on almost silently, as if life understood that certain wounds only heal in a space where the noise of urgency cannot reach. Michael no longer sought answers. There were no more questions. There were no more loose ends. The truth had been laid bare, unfiltered, and though it had left deep scars, it had also opened a clearing in the midst of the dark forest he had traversed for so many months. It still hurt, of course. Some mornings he would wake with Emily's name in his thoughts, not out of longing, but as a remnant of a love that had existed and that, even after its death, had left roots buried in parts of his memory. What followed, however, was not a euphoric new beginning, nor a romantic transition. It was a process. A rediscovery of himself. Of his identity before the pain. Of the man who had lost himself amidst frustrated attempts to sustain something that had already collapsed. Claire remained present, but never invasive. It was as if she instinctively understood that healing someone isn't about filling voids, but about accompanying them as they learn to rebuild their own spaces. She made no promises, didn't try to occupy spaces that weren't theirs, and this, for Michael, was comforting. Their meetings became less about distraction and more about genuine connection. They talked about everything, except Emily. And that, too, was part of the process. Michael was learning to tell his story without having to carry the debris of what had been destroyed. He didn't deny the past, but neither did he allow himself to live trapped in it. Little by little, he began to return to forgotten habits, to rediscover himself in small pleasures, to smile with less effort and to look at himself in the mirror with less demand. It was as if the weight he carried in his chest had been transformed into a learning experience. Emily, on the other hand, withdrew from everything. Her circle of friends naturally dissolved, not out of revenge, but as a consequence of her choices. She, who had once filled every space with her vibrant presence, was now a barely commented upon absence. When someone asked about her, the answers came with a shrug, a cautiously murmured, "I don't know." Her life seemed to continue in a kind of emotional exile, not forced, but inevitable. There was no imposed punishment, only the awareness of what had been lost. Emily now found herself in a stark reality. Without her old love, without her new one, without the unborn child, without the lies that had sustained her escapes for too long. She was finally face to face with the raw version of herself. And for the first time, she didn't try to escape. Michael didn't hate her. On the contrary, he felt something much more challenging: compassion. Not the superficial compassion of those who consider themselves morally superior, but the kind born of true understanding of another. He could see Emily as a flawed human being, hurt inside, who made bad decisions trying to escape pain she perhaps couldn't even name. It was this understanding that sustained his forgiveness. Because, deep down, he no longer held a grudge. And that was his greatest victory. But even with forgiveness, reconciliation was never a possibility. Michael knew that certain bonds, once broken so profoundly, never return to their former form. There may be respect, even distant affection, but there is no return. The love he felt for Emily was real, intense, built on sincere foundations. But it was destroyed. Not by a single mistake, but by a sequence of conscious choices. And what dies like this is not reborn, it becomes a lesson. In the months that followed, Claire's presence solidified organically, unhurriedly, unpressured. She met Michael's closest friends, shared simple dinners, long walks, and silent nights where they simply shared the same breath. She wasn't Emily's opposite, nor was she a replacement. She was something else. Another story. One that didn't try to erase the previous one, but emerged from what remained: honesty. Michael began to see in her something he'd forgotten existed: peace. Not the illusory peace of the first months of a love full of promise, but the peace that comes when one can be whole, flawed, confused, and still be accepted. Claire didn't want to save him, and that saved him. Meanwhile, Emily, even from a distance, watched from afar. She knew of Michael's movements. Not through stalking, but through fragments of information that reached her. Photos, discreet mentions, stray comments from someone they had in common. And although she told herself she had moved on, deep down, each new piece of information was a cruel reminder of what she could no longer get back. She saw Michael smiling, rebuilt, beside a woman he had chosen without pain, without sorrow, with freedom. And it tore her apart in a way she had never felt before. Not because he was happy, but because she understood that that happiness could have been with her, if she hadn't destroyed everything. One particular night, Michael was sorting through some old documents when he found, among forgotten papers, a photograph of Emily holding a sunflower, taken on a short trip years before. She was smiling, her hair tousled by the wind, and there was such pure joy in her that, for a second, he felt a pang in his chest. It wasn't longing. It was recognition. He knew, in that instant, that the woman in the photo no longer existed. Perhaps she had never fully existed. But that image represented a time when they both believed in each other. He kept the photo. Not out of attachment, but as a marker. A reminder that true love can exist, even if it doesn't last. This moment brought him a moral question that was hard to ignore: to what extent is it fair to love someone who has made so many mistakes? To what extent is it right to continue wishing well for someone who has deeply hurt us? Michael faced this internal dilemma, not with anger, but with legitimate unease. Because forgiveness was a path he had already walked. But continued compassion, that required more. And it was in this dilemma that he found an unexpected answer: it is fair, yes, to wish well. Because wishing evil imprisons us. He understood that he didn't need to forget what happened, but he also didn't need to keep reliving it. Emily would follow her path. And he, his. Each with their own burdens, their own lessons. One morning, Claire asked him if he'd ever considered moving. Not as an escape, but as a choice. Starting over in a new place, with new memories, new landscapes. Michael didn't answer right away. He spent days thinking about it. The idea of starting over somewhere else scared him less than it used to. Perhaps because, now, what he feared most, the end of something that seemed eternal, had already happened. And he survived. Better yet, he grew. A month later, they decided together to start a project in a smaller, quieter town, where Claire could open a small illustration studio and he, perhaps, could teach architecture at a local college. It wasn't a far-fetched plan. It was a feasible plan. And that was what mattered. Emily never knew exactly what this change was. She only felt, at some point, its complete absence. The certainty that there were no more traces, no more bridges, no more shortcuts to return. And in this definitive absence, she had to face, once and for all, the life she had built. Without blaming anyone. Without romanticizing what she had lost. And it was in this solitary, painful, and genuine process that she, for the first time, began to rebuild herself. Not to win herself back. But to, perhaps one day, deserve herself. Michael, closing the apartment door for the last time before moving, took a deep breath. He didn't look back. There was nothing holding him back. Only memories that no longer hurt. Next to Claire, his hand intertwined with hers, he got into the car with a light heart. Not because everything was resolved, but because he'd learned to live with the unresolvable. And that, in the end, is what frees him most. The dilemma he faced, the forgiveness he granted, the pain he endured, all of it transformed him into a man he never imagined he would be. A whole man, not because he was never broken, but because he was remade from each piece. And there was still something left to happen. Something simple, yet powerful. Something that would bring the story one last breath of truth. Because, deep down, some things only make sense when the silence is finally broken. And this story still needed one final answer. The road to the new town cut through open landscapes, gentle hills, and trees that swayed in the wind as if dancing to a music only they could hear. Michael drove in silence, his left hand firmly on the steering wheel, his right resting on Claire's knee, who slept peacefully in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, oblivious to the world. The image of her there, vulnerable and relaxed, was a living symbol of the new chapter that was opening. Unlike anything he had ever experienced, their relationship was not marked by urgency or suffocating idealizations, but by a calm sense of truth. It was a love that needed no grand gestures to be recognized, just presence, and on that clear morning, Michael understood that this kind of love could also be great, perhaps even greater. When they arrived at their new home, there wasn't much there other than stacked boxes, furniture leaning against the walls, and a breeze wafting through the rooms as if the house were breathing for the first time in years. Claire walked through the rooms in silence, taking in every detail, wondering where her easel, her paints, and her books would go. Michael followed with his eyes, noticing how effortlessly she fit in there. There was nothing forced about this new phase. It was all a natural consequence of a path paved with conscious choices. They spent the rest of the day packing up, laughing at small mishaps, sharing old memories that surfaced as they unpacked objects. That night, they sat on the living room floor, eating Chinese food straight from the packaging, and there, amidst laughter and exhaustion, Claire asked softly if he finally felt at peace. Michael took a few seconds before responding. He didn't want to give an automatic answer. He looked around, then at her, and said yes, but with raw sincerity, peace isn't the absence of pain, Claire. It's when pain stops defining who we are. She nodded, without adding words, simply extending her hand until it reached his. The gesture said it all. There was no need to say anything else. The following days followed a simple routine. Michael began teaching architecture at a local university, accepting an invitation recommended by a former professor. Claire opened a small studio downtown, where she taught drawing classes to children and sold some of her illustrations. Life there was slower, but also fuller. They learned to appreciate leisurely breakfasts, late afternoon strolls, and silent evenings reading different books on the same sofa. Neither tried to escape their pasts, but neither lived in them. It was a healthy coexistence with who they were and who they were becoming. And that, for Michael, was revolutionary. But even with everything going well, there was one point still unfinished, one last unwritten line, one last conversation that, though postponed, seemed inevitable. Emily hadn't reappeared, hadn't sent any more letters or messages, and yet, somehow, she still occupied a silent space in Michael's memory, not as a possibility of return, but as a chapter barely closed. There was something there that needed to be closed with spoken words, eye to eye. Not out of resentment, but out of respect for the story they'd lived. And it was one afternoon, while browsing the shelves of a bookstore, that the opportunity arose completely unexpectedly. As he turned the corner, he ran into their mutual friend, the same one who had once hesitated to tell the truth. She was surprised to see him there, and after a brief, polite conversation, revealed that Emily had returned to visit her parents and would be in town for a few days. It wasn't a provocation, nor an invitation. It was simply a piece of information spoken delicately, as if giving the other the chance to decide what to do with it. Michael spent the rest of the day deep in thought. He didn't mention anything to Claire that night, not by omission, but because he knew she was still digesting the idea. He woke the next day feeling lighter. He knew he had to go. Not to rehash wounds, but to put an end to something that had been on hold for too long. She called Emily late that afternoon, using the same old number. Her voice when she answered was hesitant, cautious, as if she'd been subconsciously expecting the call. He was direct. He said he was in town and wanted to talk. She took a while to answer, but eventually agreed. They arranged to meet at a discreet cafe, far from the center, where they could talk without interruptions. The next day, Michael arrived first. He chose a table in the back, ordered a black coffee, and stared out the window, watching the slow flow of people on the street. Emily arrived 10 minutes later, thinner, paler, but with the same restless look he remembered. She sat silently, making no attempt at polite smiles. There was something genuine there, for the first time in a long time. The silence was short-lived. Michael began by saying he wasn't there to place blame or reopen arguments. He said he had learned to live with everything, that he understood her reasons, even if he didn't agree. Emily listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the cup of tea in front of her. When he finished, she took a deep breath and spoke. Her voice was low but firm. She said she deeply regretted it, not for the consequences, but for the destruction she had caused someone who didn't deserve it. She had spent months trying to justify her actions, trying to find some logic that would absolve her of guilt, but that none of it could withstand the silence of the nights. She now understood that losing Michael wasn't a punishment, but the direct consequence of her own choices. And that the hardest thing to accept was knowing that he was, indeed, the love of her life, and that she had lost him anyway. Michael listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a thick silence between them, the kind of silence that carries more meaning than 1,000 words. He then said, with a calm that only time can offer, that he had also learned a lot. That he still carried pain, yes, but it no longer controlled his steps. That he had chosen to forgive her because he had discovered that the only way to move forward was to let go of what held him back. And that now, looking at her there, he didn't see an enemy. He saw a lost woman, as he too had been so many times. Emily lowered her head. A single gesture. She didn't cry. She didn't ask to come back. She didn't try to justify herself any further. She simply said, almost in a whisper, that she hoped he was truly happy with whoever was by his side now. Michael smiled. Not that toothy smile, but a brief lift of the corner of his mouth that said, "I'm fine." And then, with respect and ease, they said goodbye. Leaving the cafe, Michael walked to the town's central square. He sat on a wooden bench under the shade of a tree and remained there for a few minutes. The wind gently touched his face. He closed his eyes and let peace envelop him. It wasn't the peace of oblivion. It was the peace of acceptance. When he returned home that night, he found Claire sitting on the porch, a book on her lap and a blanket draped over her legs. She looked at him with that look that says everything without saying anything. He came over, sat beside her, and after a few seconds of silence, simply said, "I talked to her." Claire nodded. There was no jealousy, no discomfort. Just maturity. She asked if he needed to talk about it. He said no. And then he rested his head on her shoulder. They sat there, the two of them, listening to the sounds of the night, in silence. A silence full of meaning. Their story was finally where it belonged, in the present. The past, with its pain, lies, losses, and revealed truths, was now just part of who they were. It no longer defined them. It merely shaped them. And deep down, they both knew that what truly mattered was not what they had lost, but what they had built from that loss. And there was still something to be experienced. Something fate held as a final gift. Not a dramatic surprise, but a simple, definitive gesture. A final agreement that would seal everything. Because when you truly love, even stories that end leave a door open for new beginnings. And that new beginning, for Michael, was about to happen. Not with screams, not with tears, but with the gentleness of someone who has finally found what they've always sought, peace. And someone to share it with. The last time Michael entered that old house was to retrieve a book he'd forgotten on the shelf, an old copy with a worn spine, a gift from his father, which he swore he'd already put away when he moved but only noticed its absence weeks later. I was alone, as at the beginning of it all, but there was no longer any pain in the rooms, only silence. A different silence. No longer the silence of absence, but that of closure. Every wall seemed to echo not with memories, but with the weight he'd left behind. He ran his fingers over the dusty covers, found what he'd come for, and before leaving, he allowed himself one last look. There was no longing, no anger. Only a recognition, that house had been a witness to a life that no longer existed. As he closed the door, he knew, deep in his soul, that nothing there belonged to him anymore, and that, finally, he was free of everything that remained. In the months that followed, life with Claire took root with strong, discreet roots. The simple daily routine didn't hide any depth. There was love there, but not the kind that flaunts itself, it was the kind that sustains itself in silence, that blossoms in small gestures, that grows stronger in glances that understand even before words emerge. Michael taught passionately, visited sporadic construction sites as a consultant, and, in his spare time, jotted notes for a book he might one day publish. Claire painted as never before, inspired not by pain or euphoria, but by tranquility, a new source of creativity she herself hadn't known existed. Together, they created a home where everything was built with intention, without haste, without the past haunting the present. One morning, as they drank coffee in silence, Claire looked at him for a few seconds before telling him she was pregnant. She said it without ceremony, without exaggerated expectations, simply with the serenity of someone sharing life news with someone who knows how to welcome them. Michael looked at her, his eyes slightly welling up, and didn't respond immediately. He simply stood up, walked over to her, knelt beside her, and rested his forehead against her still imperceptible belly. He didn't cry. He didn't smile euphorically. He simply felt. He felt everything at once, the pain of what had been, the fear of what was to come, the joy of being there, whole, ready to experience what he never imagined he deserved after all this. It was in that silent gesture that Claire understood he was ready. Not just to be a father, but to truly begin again. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Emily was following a very different path. She decided to stay away, even with the possibility of returning, even with her family's vague invitations to reconnect. She lived in a small, simple, almost Spartan apartment. She worked as a copy editor for an online publisher, a job that allowed her to stay home, isolated, away from the social contact that still suffocated her. Not because the world rejected her, but because she still rejected herself. She began therapy hesitantly, then with greater commitment. In her sessions, she revisited moments from her childhood, her marriage, her loss, her lies. Michael's face on the day they said goodbye. She told herself she was trying to become a better person, not to be loved again, but to, perhaps one day, be able to love herself. She no longer sought reconciliation. Nor forgiveness. She knew she had already received more than she deserved. She knew his loss was a deserved consequence, and that continuing to seek redemption with him would be selfishness disguised as regret. She dreamed of the child who never came. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night with the feeling she'd heard a cry, or felt a light weight on her lap. Other times, she found herself doing calculations, imagining how many months he'd be, what his face would look like, if he'd have her eyes or the smile of, no. She never said his name. It was as if naming him would bring back everything she swore she never wanted to touch again. Deep down, Emily knew she'd never stop carrying that pain, but she also knew she needed to transform it into something. Silently, she wrote letters. She never sent them. He kept them in a wooden box under his bed. Letters to her son, to Michael, to herself. It was her way of keeping from going crazy. One day, she decided to donate the books she had kept for years. Among them, she found a scribbled copy, an old dedication, "For us, for all our tomorrows." It was a gift she had given to Michael in the first months of their marriage. Seeing those words, she took a deep breath and, for the first time, read them aloud. When she finished, she cried. Not because she wanted to return to the past, but because she finally accepted that he was gone. And that now, it was up to her to build another future. One that, even without company, could be worthy of peace. In their new city, Michael and Claire prepared the baby's room. Together, they painted the walls light green, put up small shelves with picture books, and a handmade mobile she'd made hung over the crib. Every object there held meaning. It wasn't a room assembled with haste or anticipation, but with calm love. Michael, observing it all, often found himself reflecting on the irony of life. Everything he thought he'd lost had brought him here. The pain he'd thought unbearable was the bridge to a new meaning. And it was in this recognition that he found peace. True peace. The kind that comes when there's nothing left to hide from oneself. A few months later, the baby was born. A girl. Dark eyes, long fingers, and a calm expression like her mother's. In the hospital, when he held her for the first time, Michael said nothing. He just cried. Claire, lying down, watched the scene with a tired but full smile. There, in that moment, a cycle closed. Not because the past had been forgotten, but because he had finally fulfilled his role, to teach, shape, and prepare. Nothing Michael experienced was in vain. Every tear, every silence, every truth discovered served to shape him into that man, the one who now held in his arms the life he never imagined he would have, but always deserved. Emily learned of her daughter's birth by chance, through a discreet post by someone in town. She saw the picture, recognized the name. She felt no envy. No sadness. Just a strange kind of silent gratitude. Because, despite everything, he was okay. And she knew this was the only way she, too, would one day be able to find peace. She wrote a final letter that night. She poured it all out, her flaws, her fears, her true feelings. She ended by saying she didn't expect a reply, she just wanted him to know that if that letter ever reached him, she had finally understood. That the love she destroyed was the greatest she'd ever known, and that losing that love was the greatest lesson of her life. She didn't send it. But this time, she didn't keep it. She burned the letter. He watched the flames consume the paper, and with it, everything he needed to let go. In that solitary, symbolic gesture, Emily did what she had never been able to do before, she freed herself. And so, each went their own way. Not as victims or villains, but as human beings trying, in whatever way they knew how, to make sense of their pain and choices. Because, in the end, that's what remains, what we do with what tears us apart. Comment below what you thought of this story, which character touched you most, and what you would do in their shoes. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more moving stories like this. And take this reflection with you, betrayal doesn't just destroy the other person. It destroys what's most precious: trust, affection, truth. Cheating is denying love in its purest form. It's like breaking a mirror and expecting the image to remain intact. This channel does not support any type of betrayal. Here, we tell stories to remind people that fidelity is not an obligation, it's a choice of respect and true love. Until the next story.